Okay, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Sean, for joining us. So my name is Grace Law, and I'm chair of the Department of Architecture here at the GSD. Positions, as you know, is a series of conversations convened by our department aimed at revealing the positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. This series hopes to unfold the complexity of relations and metaphors and to make them explicit to you all, inviting faculty and guests to voice where they stand. And so we're really delighted today to welcome Sean Canty. Sean is an assistant professor of architecture here at the GSD and the founder of Studio Sean Canty, an architecture practice based in Cambridge. Studio Sean Canty choreographs novel relationships between spaces of contemplation and collective gathering. The work of the studio engages formal combination and juxtaposition at a variety of scales, from objects to interiors, to full buildings, and explores a range of programmatic types, from domestic environments to cultural spaces. Sean is also a founding principal of Office Roman numeral 3, Office 3, an experimental architectural collective that spans New York, San Francisco, and Cambridge. And selected as a finalist for the 2016 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Competition, this collaboration has completed a Welcome Center for Governor's Island and exhibited work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And prior to founding these studios, Sean was a project designer at Iwamoto Scott Architecture in San Francisco. Sean's work and writing has been published in Pinup, Mass Context, Harvard Design Magazine, and Domus. He has received fellowships and awards in recognition of his work from the Richard Rogers Fellowship and was a finalist in the Civitella Ranieri Architecture Prize competition, among others. He has lectured at institutions including UPenn, UC Berkeley, and the GSA Graduate School of Architecture, that is, at the University of Johannesburg. Prior to joining our faculty here at the GSD, Sean held teaching positions at the Cooper Union, Berkeley, and the CCA. In addition to architecture design, we are really proud of Sean's leadership as coordinator of Core 1. He has also taught classes on descriptive geometry and design media. He received an MArch from Harvard GSD and a BArch from the CCA. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks to Grace and the Department of Architecture for allowing me to share my work here at home. I titled this talk Recomposition, Abstract Social. The work I have been pursuing through my practice studio SC is derived from an interest in thoughtful engagements with building typologies and geometries. In our fast-paced world that we inhabit, our spaces can serve as sanctuaries, retreats from the chaos and expressions, from the chaos of the world and the expressions of our identities. By examining the intimate relationship between personal narrative and built environments, the work tries to uncover the ways in which architecture becomes a intimate conduit for self-expression, cultural preservation, and beauty and betterment. Through methods of formal abstraction that are thoughtfully placed to orchestrate social experience. The studio doubles down on robust familiar forms with a renewed attention to the experiences that they shape. And so we are given this prompt of maybe thinking about or positioning our work through or a project through a kind of past project, kind of present series of works that we're thinking about, and how we might be moving forward in the future with our work. So I want to start with a few of my heroes. I've always been drawn to formal abstraction, especially in painting and other artistic practices where universal forms, what we might call platonic shapes, become personal, infused with history and narratives that are both symbolic and complex. Here we have the work of Robert Mangold, whose lifelong engagement with the formal elements of painting, and in particular his meditations on the circle, with his ring painting series. These work produced between the late 1990s and early 2000s are a distinct exploration of shape, color, line, through the recurring figure of the circle. Each work is rendered with subtle, muted hues, soft greens, burnt oranges, and subdued grays. And these imperfect circles and the meandering line that are inscribed within them always seem to suggest or imply a narrative or a conversation between spatial figures, while also indexing the process of the artist and inviting a quiet engagement with each piece. His lines are often hand-drawn, not mechanically precise, so they evoke a sense of intimacy and imperfection, challenging the uniformity typically associated with minimalism and abstraction. Here, figures in a meandering line form satisfying relationships through formal tangency, giving a sensation of movement and variation. The asymmetry of the lines inscribed is deliberate. They cross the canvas boundaries, creating a tension between the form and the space around it. And in effect, this allows the shapes to seem both contained within and extending beyond the canvas, suggesting a larger and perhaps more intimate gestures of continuity. As a student here at the GSD, I had the opportunity of working with both Scott Cohen and Cameron Wu, who now teaches at Princeton. The Wu House was one project that they both collaborated on and worked together with that was quite inspiring to me as a student. The house is composed of 3 vaulted chambers. Elliptical cylinders and cones pass between each vault and intersect along a saddle-like valley, which produces a kind of continuous, sinuous line that is orchestrated through a very careful relationship of tangency. Inside, this is the thing that I kind of found surprising, was these intersections create these kind of lariat-shaped openings at the ceiling planes, resulting in spaces that are physically separated, but let's say visually and acoustically connected. This led to an interest in introducing a particular class of geometries within my work as a means of disrupting and challenging conventional notions of composition. Although we might perceive these as blank primitives, they are never entirely neutral. Scale, size, structural stability, aesthetic value, each imbue these forms with potential. So on the one hand, they're kind of well-known units of form, but they carry, let's say, 2 sets of relationships, one of measurement and one of perception. This is a third project that I often refer back to. This is called House of the Future by David Hammonds. The artwork comprises of a meticulously crafted 2-story structure positioned diagonally on a corner lot. Despite its title, the house's architectural elements feel familiar, as if belonging to its time or a recent past. All the elements are sourced from demolition sites around Charleston, South Carolina. Its components allow the house to navigate between being a relic of the past and, let's say, a harbinger of new possibilities. The inversion between the project's title, House of the Future, and the structure's actual appearance prompts a reevaluation of, let's say, traditional concepts of progress and aspiration. Hammonds uses reclaimed materials, evokes cultural traditions within Black and marginalized communities, emphasizing practices of reuse and revitalization born out of necessity. The perceptual transition between the old and new presents an aesthetic that is both relaxed and precise and contextual, echoing the neighboring domestic houses while differing in the expression of its parts. The sculpture's scale and its abnormal footprint, 1/3 of that of the neighboring residences, draws attention to its anomalous presence, reflecting on its typological origins, the Charleston single house. The editing of this architectural type through its reconstitution of materials and organizational order challenges viewers to engage with the structure's meditation on the aesthetic values of progress and newness, care, and reuse. As you'll see later, this project led me to reflect on my own personal history. These are 2 structures built by my great-grandfather, Edgar Canty, in Elliott, South Carolina. And so mixing these past sources led me to think about this idea of recomposition, particularly in jazz, but in the song by Duke Ellington called Coco, This idea of recomposition is kind of latent in the genre of jazz more broadly, by which notes on a paper, which are meant to kind of last for eternity, comes into tension with the integration and improvisation of the solo. So much of jazz puts forward a kind of call and response in its compositional arrangement, and thus entangles the labor of the author and performer in ways that gives each an active role in shaping the content being performed. This improvisational framework lets us participate in the protocols of arrangement and composition and narrative, and yet gives artists the running room to depart, embellish, add, and generate new tangents to the overall composition without diminishing the integrity of the original. And so this was a kind of conversation recently within the pro seminar here for the MRTs, but I suppose my current state of my practice has been trying to kind of bounce between these three categories that we engage with as architects. On the one hand, our disciplinary desires, questions of representation, geometry, fabrication, history, and other discursive obsessions that we might have as designers, or expanded terms of discourse, new ideas on theory, aesthetics, and philosophy, and then, of course, the contemporary and pressing challenges of our time: climate, sustainability, migration, social equity, and housing. So I'll start with a few past projects. The first is the Janus House. This was one of the first projects that pardon me, let me go back for a second, that I started while beginning my teaching here at the GSD, and one of the first moments in which I was trying to kind of marry this idea of a kind of formal abstraction to orchestrate a kind of new social experience. The Janus House, the prompt was a kind of two houses within one, within a suburban lot. And the idea was to kind of mix these two typologies of organization. On the one hand, the dog trot house, which is mostly found in more southern context, which is a house that is kind of split in half by a breezeway, and the courtyard typology, which is a series of rooms that are organized around a perimeter with a negative center or a void. And I was kind of interested in merging these two organizations, one that's really thinks about the axial, and the other one that really thinks about something in the round. The house's twin logic is established by the transformation of the dog trot, which is characterized by a covered space and two gabled wings. While the dog trot is inherently symmetrical in plan, the Janus House signals a kind of different organization. Public spaces are concentrated towards the front of the house, while the private spaces of the residences are kind of on the back half. In thinking about the plan of the house, I was really interested in other kind of twin conditions within architecture, particularly the Piazza del Popolo, the twin churches that exist here. The twin churches have formal similarities on the exterior, but they have kind of organizational differences within their interior. One is more axial, so it has a kind of closer relationship to the piazza, while the other one is more centralized. And so the two residences occupy the left and right wing of the house, whose boundary line is blurred by the relationship of the courtyard. And the courtyard complicates the kind of didactic parity of the dog trot plan and introduces a kind of more ambiguous center within the interior. The house has a kind of, exhibits a kind of sublimation on the front and a kind of geometric plasticity on the back. There's a kind of restrained introversion which conceals the relationship of each side of the interior spaces. The courtyard becomes a kind of space of shared negotiation between the left and right side. It's a space where both the private and public spaces kind of look into, but the perimeter, the other accessories such as curtains can allow for that situation to kind of change over time in terms of its privateness or its publicness. The second project is called the Tall House, and this was a proposal for a house in Oakland, California, on a kind of squarish lot. It's identifiable by a kind of exaggerated slanted roof, and is an interplay between square and circular forms, or we can think of this as kind of high-res and low-res forms nested within each other. These two primitives are kind of entangled through a series of geometric tucks, which complicates the envelope in different ways for light, entry, and informal purchase. This offered an opportunity to craft distinct interior and exterior experiences, as well as everything that happens in between. Roof windows on the upper floors provide programmatic views of the property, a peaceful retreat in the midst of the bustling urban neighborhood. And the project aims to provide a sense of privacy and tranquility within this kind of industrial area of Oakland. In our approach, we were interested in composing a house that contained a small internal atrium, offering the internal section to have visual and sonic exchanges across all three levels as its footprint decreases for light and air. The ground floor exhibits kind of en-suite guest rooms, kitchen, open living and dining spaces, while on the upper floors, the relationship inverts and the primary suite and workspaces look outward. The house stands out as kind of distinct with its slanted roof and uniform corrugated steel cladding, echoing the mixity of industrial and residential vernaculars that are nearby. Last year, I was awarded I was a part of one of the Art League awardees of 2023, and this presented an opportunity to kind of have an online exhibition, but to kind of think through additional representations of the house. In this case, pulling apart its let's say, three envelopes: the exterior, the envelope that negotiates between the interior and exterior, and then the envelope of the interior atrium. The interior of the house revolves around this central void, illuminated by a circular skylight. This image shows this house at the beginning of becoming a home. The house's occupants are moving in, boxes are being unpacked, art is being hung. These careful acts of placing and arranging the space are profoundly personal dialogue between the occupants and the space of architecture. Let's see if I can get the video to play. And so for the League Prize online exhibition, this was a moment captured in a kind of a cinematograph, a still photograph in which minor and repeated movements occur. As the first acts of homemaking are taking place, the interstitial space between the spectrums of domestic life embedded in the house and home call our attention. The cinematograph suspends the time around this moment of uncomfortable occupation where one makes do until things are just right. So Presently, I am working on a kind of interior renovation, but also have been doing some speculative work in collaborations with a close friend of mine. The first project is called the Linwood Residence. And the project after that I'll present is the Crown House. At the start of the Linwood Residence, this was a renovation for a colonial historic home in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, where an African-American family wanted to think about aging in place. The elders, whose primary bedroom is on the second floor, wanted to relocate the primary bedroom and primary bathroom to the first floor because it was becoming quite difficult for them to kind of traverse up the staircase. So the prompt or the brief was kind of in two phases: to move those two program requirements to the lower level, and then the second phase would be to renovate the second level to house her younger daughter and 3 children. At the start, we looked at ideas from the feminist scholar and cultural critic Bell Hooks on notions of homemaking and Blackness. She has written extensively about the concept of home and its social, cultural, and political implications, emphasizing the importance of inclusive spaces, the intersection of identities, individuals, and the house as a site of resistance and respite. In the context of the residence, this translated into a kind of two-phase approach. First, recraft the existing ground floor and accommodate the new primary bedroom and bathroom for the house's elders, and in phase 2, to renovate the second level for their daughter and grandchildren. We did kind of extensive profiles of each of our subjects, their kind of likes about the current home, dislikes, objects that were meaningful and important to them, all carefully documented. So this is the plan of the existing house. The lower front portion is the original classical home, and then sometime after there was an annex added in the back to house the kitchen and storage. So this was the task, to kind of move this space to the lower level and to rethink the annex in the way that house that program, but also becomes a kind of central condenser, programmatic condenser between the two families, generations of families. We did a number of studies of thinking about sequence, circulation, and degrees of addition. And in the end, decided not to change the envelope too much, just to kind of avoid some pragmatic things around permitting, but to kind of really make do with the volume that was there. So beyond that boundary, we crafted 4 spaces through a series of surgical interventions. First, opening up the wall, separating the kitchen and dining room, allowing the 3 rooms with distinct social functions to be visually accessible to each other, and producing an interconnected space. And secondly, the inscription of a series of archways to denote transitions between public and private spaces. Hooks argues for the significance of aesthetics and beauty in the home environment, and so as sources of nourishment and inspiration for the Black diaspora, we tried to draw inspiration from the Black visual canon to source color, texture, and compositional motifs. The Pan-African flag and its colors served as accent colors throughout the space, while the works of Basquiat, Kerry James Marshall, and Yvonne Jackson served as symbolic and visual sources to highlight Black leisure, respite, joy, and comfort. We inscribed arches to act as focal points within the space and key thresholds between rooms. They create a sense of visual continuity, allowing sight lines to flow seamlessly from one space to the other, while complementing some of the traditional motifs of the house. And so the plan is quite pragmatic, but there's a lot of things that are happening in elevation and section that are much more surprising. One of the other things was to kind of think about integrating both old and new objects within the interior. So it was important that our representations of the project incorporated family heirlooms and cherished items of sentimental value, and the habits and rituals of the day-to-day. For us, they infused the space with personal and cultural significance, from the okra on the kitchen counter to the John Coltrane vinyl stored in the family den, the glass of Uncle Nearest whiskey in the dining room, and the extensive book collection of the mother elder. So this is the family room, the dining room, and by removing the wall between the kitchen and dining room, we allow natural light to kind of flow freely between the two spaces, creating a brighter and more open atmosphere. An archway beyond marks the transition to the new primary bedroom suite for the elder couple. The new suite is designed to evoke a sense of coziness while incorporating colors inspired by the Pan-African flag. In conclusion, the renovation for this multi-generational residence is an attempt of incorporating design strategies that, on the one hand, echo some of the ideas of bell hooks, but also the kind of the current set of relationships and objects and people that are already within the home. The next project is called the Crown House. This was a collaboration between myself and a close friend, JG, who teaches at MIT. This was a proposal for RFP, and we were really interested in kind of rethinking the single-family home through an idea of type to accommodate both singular and collective forms of living. And we're posed this question of what is architecture's role in this process. We were also very much engaged in conversations around the intersection of identity, art, and craft, and were inspired by the multivalent meanings of the crown and Basquiat's paintings. These symbols were meant to signal greatness and aspiration, but also the struggle and challenges that come with achievement and power. Basquiat's formal language was about affirming fusion, mixing, and improvising through symbol and figure. And for us, this meant rethinking the home in a way to assemble and assert possibly excluded groups into the lineage of the American dream, and to use the figure of the crown as a symbolic motif to conjure up both mutable and multiple definitions of achievement. Adapting the visual and geometric language of Basquiat's crowns, peaks are arranged in symmetrical or serial arrangements to oscillate between a sawtooth and a gable roof profile, the iconic and the familiar, and between domestic and work typologies. We were very much inspired by this interest in superimposing or hybridizing two traditional roof forms within the framework of a singular house. And we're also inspired by domestic types of the triple-decker and the shotgun house, which expanded access to home ownership by increasing density and reconceiving the physical and social envelope of the nuclear family. But these typologies at the current moment kind of fail to engage alternative models of family or program of living and working together. So this is the front of the house, which kind of sports a gable front. Along the long elevation, the sawtooth emerges. And there's a kind of inverse repetition or oscillation of the sawtooth from one side of the house to the other. In thinking through this framework, we decided to kind of devise three separate plans or three possible plans that could come from an idea of thinking about room organization through the profile of a roof. And so through its reconfigurable cellular plan and individual access to each bedroom, Crown House is a kind of mutable and fluid system where we can move from single family, multifamily, and live-work organizations. So the first plan is imagining the entirety of the space as a kind of loft or live-work space for an artist. The second is a single-family house, and then the third is a kind of collective living scenario in which there are 3 stacked live and work units within the plan. And just to kind of end on this as a kind of ode to Basquiat, we thought it would be good to, or interesting to kind of situate the model within a kind of fictional studio of his, looking at his one of his workspaces in New York City, but also as a way of kind of unpacking the modules of the house as a system that could possibly be reconfigured or to create other forms of plans or arrangements of living through its parts. And so now we're kind of thinking about the future, and in doing so, I had to kind of revisit the past. And so this next project is called Edgar's Shed, and this was presented at the 2003 Venice Biennial, curated by Leslie Loco, and under the theme Laboratory of the Future. Edgar's Shed draws inspiration from 2 ordinary sheds crafted by my great-grandfather Edgar, or I call him Bubba, located in Elliott, South Carolina. These sheds have become a constant source of reflection for my practice, representing a pair despite their distinct characters. Bubba, a carpenter and craftsman, dedicated his life to refining and crafting these buildings through alteration, extension, and care. One shed served as my grandmother's home, while the other functioned as a juke joint, both featuring low-pitched gabled roofs, cinder block, and wood bases. The installation acknowledges the often overlooked and foreign practices steeped in black vernacular spatial practices. From these simple forms, born out of necessity, extraordinary inventions and innovations emerged. The values of material reuse, care, and maintenance were central to these spaces, representing their essence. Importantly, these sheds were places of daily life where joy, struggle, and growth were protected from social adversity. The space of the home for many African Americans and other marginalized groups is precisely the space where culture and domesticity intersect. From the juke joint to the Harlem rent parties, the project emphasizes the need to revisit and incorporate marginalized traditions in the ongoing work of architectural practice, calling attention to the importance of recognizing and celebrating these traditions that have been historically sidelined. So this serves as a kind of enduring exploration of my own aesthetic inheritance, shedding light on the gaps in aesthetic knowledge and practices that are absent in current architectural discourse. The building on the right with the juke joint, the building on the left, the building on the left was the juke joint, the building on the right was the house that my grandmother grew up in. And juke joints trace their origins back to slave quarters, where enslaved Africans created spaces for merriment and joy. Over time, these spaces evolved into kind of unlicensed establishments, often located in hidden backwoods of rural and urban areas. But they provided spaces for working people to gather, enjoy music, dancing, food, often selling homemade alcohol like white fog or moonshine. So this is the plan of the installation in the context of the Giardini in Venice. Within the exhibition space, the shed serves as a simple yet versatile function, offering rooms for display and events. The roof is symbolically overscaled, and it acts as a primary shelter element for setting the stage for the installation. So in a sense, I kind of made a huge model inspired by the two sheds to display the two original sheds within the context of the biennial. In this process, I revisited some earlier research. Given that Bubba was a carpenter, I had been working on some research with AKT2, Hanif Kara, and Eduardo Tabuzzi on thinking through questions of fabrication around curved structures, particularly structural cassettes. This research was then elevated to kind of think how could we fabricate the structure in Venice, and how could we do it in a way that allowed the thing to be dismantled, assembled easily, but dismantled easily and reused for another context. So the design prioritizes easy disassembly and reusability of components, embodying the values of reuse and sustainability. The precision of modeling and coordination with the fabrication team was super important, and also a lot of really early meetings with my European partners. The structure was fabricated just outside of Rome, all milled. And as Bubba was a carpenter and craftsman, the use of wood also reflects his skill, expertise, and dedication to his craft. But also, woodworking has a long-standing tradition in many cultures, and in particularly here in North America. The lighting design in Eggert Shed installation plays a significant role in reflecting the contrasting vibes between the house in a juke joint and the shift from day to night. This is indicated from the shift from pink to blue lighting and the transition over the course of the day. Formally, there's a kind of juxtaposition between precision and informal within the language. I like to call this a kind of relaxed precision, where there's a kind of juxtaposition between two aesthetics, one that is precise and one that is quite casual. It invites viewers to contemplate the coexistence of the refined and the imperfect, and captures the layered narratives and complexities inherent within the two sheds. And then underneath the sheds, we presented model replicas of the two original buildings as a kind of form of documentation and archiving. My mother was incredibly helpful throughout this process and helping me recall some of the spaces and dimensions of the original sheds. So I won't play all of this, but this project was the kind of first in kind of thinking about a more thoughtful pursuit of architecture, breathing new life into the past while building towards the future. It exemplifies the power of design as a way to reimagine and transmit cultural heritage, fostering a greater understanding of our own aesthetic identities and opening up avenues for exploration, reflection, and reconstruction. What's more uncomfortable than leaning into the space of your own identity and history? I would say that this is a form of homemaking that allows us to recenter some of our own narratives. Playlist was provided by my mother, recounting songs from the jukebox and the juke joint, and the soundscape was put together by my former student, Darian Carr. And recently we worked on a proposal for an installation called Home Base. This was also another collaboration with AKT2 and their team. This is a verse, and I won't try to rap it, but it's from Fresh Prince and Jazzy Jeff. It's from a song called Summertime. And this installation was kind of for a kind of large collective space, temporary collective space for a kind of park. And in this case, we kind of proposed designing a pavilion to celebrate the tradition of within American society that I think is kind of transcends boundaries, a kind of ritual that happens every summer, the barbecue or the cookout. So we wanted to kind of craft a space for gathering and togetherness, where cookouts bring close friends, families, and relatives together. And we also kind of wanted to kind of recast the vibe of the Summertime video, which takes place in a kind of park in Philadelphia. We were drawing from Black spatial practices and rituals around gathering and communing, revisiting some of the works of Kerry James Marshall, some of the formal qualities of David Hammond's, and his idea of reuse and care, and then the idea of the table and the work of Kerry James, and the work of Carrie Mae Weems. And in doing some research, we found that the cookout is, or the barbecue was a kind of confluence of many cultures from their own barbecuing traditions. It originated in the American barbacoa cooking practices of the Native American community, and was adopted by European settlers and evolved within the context of slavery. African slaves often tended to the barbecue pit construction, meat preparation, seasoning, and flavors. And so this ritual of the American barbecue represents a kind of fusion of African, European, and Native American culinary practices. The pavilion creates intimacy by replicating the specificity of domestic architecture within the pavilion. The articulation of a casual perimeter, both enclosed and open, in turn shapes a series of pavilion entrances that act as both passages for intimate gatherings and movement into its center. As the interior spaces within the pavilion intersect, views fragment, converge, and stretch along various paths, moving the experience of the pavilion between the singular and the collective. So we kind of imagine this as a kind of a small village in the round. At the center is a sizable courtyard, which acts like a shared backyard, where collective conversations, performances, and open-air dining experiences were envisioned. As the interior spaces within the pavilion intersect, views fragment, converge, and along circulatory paths, and allows you to kind of be caught between both interior experiences, but also the things that are happening around this perimeter. And then again, we were kind of reflecting and meditating our choice and use of wood, both as a kind of practice of light frame construction here in America, but also integrating it with mass timber and structural cassettes, a structural cassette for the roof. So this is kind of where we are now, and kind of thinking about this idea of a kind of tension between the refined and imperfect, but also trying to move architecture towards both collective and singular experiences. So with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a few questions, if this is okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, because it's great to see the spectrum of work I feel like I've known Sean for quite some time, but to see it sort of put together in terms of this format, I begin to understand a little bit more some of your own interests and how they're shaping as we move into the future. So I was super fascinated by your diagram, the triangular diagram, which was articulated that you are working between three modes: disciplinary desires, aesthetics, and then the third pole, which is contemporary exigencies. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your process, because everybody knows, I would imagine in a way, you present it as an equilateral triangle. At the same time, where do you start? In the marriage between, let's say, vernacular forms and, let's say, Platonic or primitive shapes and things like that you're working with on a formal level, I really would love to understand what is the origin and how does the process unfold for you? Mm-hmm. When do things get layered in?
Yeah. I mean, I would say for a while, a lot of the interest was in the kind of first bucket, the disciplinary desires, really working through formal digressions or obsessions over the relationship between figures and what certain kinds of forms enable you to do spatially. I think a square operates differently spatially than a circle, and there's perceptual and formal perceptual and representational questions or baggage that comes with each figure. Having that understanding kind of in the background has then kind of allowed me to kind of find opportunities of placing them in the projects and the work when appropriate. But I would say that sometimes, an idea of aesthetics or just the problem at hand might outweigh that kind of formal ambition. For instance, in the interior renovation, finding the opportunity for architecture to exist there was quite hard because you're dealing with so much tight budget, existing furniture paired with new furniture, and two generations, right? And so the arches were really the kind of thing that were the thresholds between those spaces, were the opportunities to kind of think about the placement of my own desires within all of those constraints. So I say it's kind of weighted per project, but definitely started with just a kind of obsession and knowledge of what forms can do, and then finding the proper placements of those.
And I felt that's very helpful to understand, because I feel like maybe another question that stems from that for me is, some of the more current work and or in the Biennale, you were led, or you were working with, let's say, wood frame construction, which lends itself to certain kinds of both framing techniques and certain geometries which are more comfortable in the realm of framing and wood construction in particular. And then I was thinking about some of your other projects, and even the Linwood residence, because of the arches and things like that have a tendency not to work as cleanly, even though we understand wood framing to be so flexible. I'm curious to wonder about where, if you had material palettes of any spectrum, would you stay with that type of framing capacities, or would you actually look at other materials and other things? I'm curious more because I'm wondering about the relationship between certain kinds of form making, which are driven by your tangent and interest in sphere and conical and arched vaulted shapes, versus those which have to deal with more of the shed condition, which seem like there's a kind of inherent tension in that, which I find very productive.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where maybe kind of the material research, which is happening alongside of the work, has been interesting. Of one, where do you place your priorities within a project? So where can things be quite dumb and normal, and then where do you need to have a high degree of resolution? I think the kind of rediscovery of the structural cassette, which is traditional framing practices sandwiched between two layers of plywood, allow for to build on that tradition of framing, but also can allow for prefabrication so that the conceit of the curvature can be kind of assembled or pre-assembled beforehand and broken apart and brought to the site in a way that is a little bit more efficient and economical.
I'd like to turn it over to our guests. Oh, sorry, I didn't see it right behind me.
John, thanks so much. It was very exciting to see all of your work. I loved the juxtaposition between informal and formal, and I'm wondering if you can talk more about your thought process. I think you started and ended with a project that was sort of presented in the more formal manner that maybe we're accustomed to, and then in between it was really fascinating to see how you chose to not stage or to informally stage the projects. You know, you left the sheet on the statue, there were the kids' blocks in the picture. And then on the other hand, for your house, or your shed, sorry, you know, you showed the models on stacked CMU blocks, but with very formal lighting and a kind of formal video. And so, just talk us through this. You know, what were you thinking, and why did you make these interesting choices?
I guess that's a great question. I guess that stems from maybe an idea of you know, something I learned here, that the way in which a kind of exception against the norm maybe calls attention to the things that we take for granted in our day-to-day. And so the juxtaposition of something that's quite conventional or normative against something quite exceptional, whether that be lighting or you know, the white museum board model on top of the cinder block, puts those things in conversation by having one be a foil to the other. So I think it's just something that that's kind of evolved with the thinking, but also the work. Yeah.
Maybe that also relates to something that you're doing. It's both the informal and the formal, but also as you show here, the kind of vernacular and the combination of vernacular issues or ideas or aesthetic iconicity paired with other issues of the formal geometries. It feels like those are also the things that and to me, it's also more explicit today than it was, you know, 45 years ago. So I think that's really interesting, that trajectory. Another question here.
You talked about the inspiration in the beginning. I unfortunately forgot the artist, about the drawing line, which sometimes finds its inaccuracy you find interesting. Do you still find that in your work? And if so, at what time? Like the inaccuracy? Because I feel like it's getting harder and harder working with softwares which make it very accurate, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is all. I mean, these questions are all kind of along a similar theme. So I've been kind of, you know, really particularly here obsessed with, you know, the way in which starting from the precise can produce the effect of the imperfect. You know, you can form a tangent to a curve that continues that curve on a new trajectory, or you can return it backwards where it looks like it's broken, but it's still tangent. So I'm kind of, you know, interested in kind of working back and forth, you know, between the dumb and the sophisticated, or the high res and the low res, or and the imperfect. For instance, like the imperfect in this case, just kind of sets up a basic conceit of that the siding can be horizontal or vertical, but how they do it in the field in the end, it doesn't really matter to me, I suppose. Like that it could be a number of ways, but to kind of set that up in motion so that if something does imperfect happen in the field, it's already accounted for in the thought process.
Sean, thank you so much. I mean, it's really nice to see how you're building up certain ideas and you're thinking about them, and some are, you kind of got to some of them you're going to get to them. And so I think that that whole process is really great to see. One of the themes that comes up in the work is really and it's something that I'm personally very interested in, is the way in which the idea of a kind of adaptation or modification of something produces a new condition. So you showed us David Hammond, and David Hammond makes a house which is not really an occupiable house, but it produces certain exaggeration of conditions that are still recognizable as house, but it is to do with that idea of the deformation in some way. But the deformation also makes sense. I mean, so maybe it's not a house, it's a pavilion, but it's something that still utilizes that. And you can speak about the spatial characteristics of that. And when you talk about your grandfather's house, the idea that somebody is modifying something and is, like the architectural project is like a project that is worked on, then that also means that after a while there are certain changes that are made through this process of modification. So I guess the question is, are there specific moments where you can think about something new, but you can speak about the specifics of something that has been modified previously? By which I mean, like from David Hammond we can take something, from your grandfather's house we can take something. But because you're doing a new thing, that new thing doesn't necessarily speak of the idea of modification. It's already a synthetic project that's in your head that's like realized when you're doing the project for the Biennale. So I guess the question more specifically is like, what is the role of these precedents that you're looking at, which invariably involve forms of reutilization of materials that have been in the past, or the idea of modifying things that have started one way and been shaped as the precursors of something new? Because, like, is it necessary for you when people visit the Venice Biennale to be aware of your position in that regard? Do you see what I'm trying to get at in terms of like the things that have existed before and their reutilization as the basis for something new?
I suppose this is why earlier in the talk I introduced the analogy of recomposition, how it works in jazz and classical music would be called like imitatio, where there is an existing piece, but it doesn't. Well, the jazz solo allows you to kind of play off of that existing piece, but you're also kind of you have your own style, you have your own vibe in how you enter into that piece, and so and to do a solo is actually quite difficult. It takes some time to kind of build up the skill set to be a soloist within a piece on a jazz band. So I do see that there's a bit of autonomy on the one hand in working through something. I would say perhaps the selection of things that I'm choosing to use the work through is probably where my voice comes in. Like the curation of that content is where my voice comes in more emphatically. So, it is important to kind of have David Hammond's there, present in the background, and my grandfather there in the background, because it allows me to kind of rethink the content of architecture, the discipline, in a very unique way that I haven't been taught to do in school or in practice. I hope that kind of answers the question, but.
Hey, Sean. Going off, sorry, the same vein of a question, I guess, being more specific related to some of the stuff we're doing in studio. This past project we just finished is also similarly this idea of recomposition of something that was existing, working in two parts. We've been talking about whether there's like the chronological time, like sense to that project of whether it came with that original tower that we did and then an extension. I'm not necessarily talking to, like, I guess everyone other than my own cohort right now. But is there like a, what's the role of like history and time that's very visible in, very similarly to that question, if there's something that directly speaks to the past or to the vestiges of what you began with, or whether that's sort of implied in the context it's rooted in, or whether it's like embedded in the actual formal gestures that are present.
I think it's all of those things actually. Context, the baggage that comes with the form that's being used, the baggage of a type. I also just think that, you know, there's also a kind of maybe a larger, connecting you and Moisen's question, like the ways in which my identity has traditionally been, how it relates to space traditionally is always through something that is inherited, not something that is generated from anew. So I think that that's something I've been struggling with, but also just quite honest about and trying to find inventive ways of dealing with that. Yeah.
If I can jump in on that a little bit, in a recent conversation with you, Sean, outside of any of this context when we were just chatting, you mentioned something super interesting to me that might shed some light on both of these questions. You said to me that many of the artists and architects and designers working in the space of historic precedents that have been inherited sometimes operate on an aesthetic projection which embraces certain kind of maybe this is not right, but let's say the shoddiness of the construction, the shabbiness of it, or the inexpensive qualities of it, the imprecision of it, is not necessarily something that you actually like the fact that your work can absorb some of the form making per se, but that you actually you are very interested in the craftedness and formal precision that is actually not embodied in those precedents. Maybe you can say something along because I felt like you were saying something to me in our intimate conversation just about something else that seems like that is paramount because you actually want to project a kind of work that does rely on a certain degree of high degree of precision, and maybe the improvisational line that we were seeing in the early artist works is actually the human body, the circulation path and things like that we take as occupants of those buildings. But maybe you could say something more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Kerry James Marshall has this idea of mastery by which he critiques the canon of painting. On the one hand, the absence of people of color and their identities within that tradition. But he doesn't, his idea of mastery is to master the skill sets of the painterly canon in order to make the critique and to reintroduce the black body into that work. And at the same time, he's incredibly inventive. I mean, his work does not look like anyone else's, so it is a new thing that he brings to the table and through this idea of mastery. So I think that high degree of technical control, a kind of doubling down, can kind of still allow you to be critical and inventive through the canon or the discipline that you've inherited it. So I firmly believe in that idea of mastery.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Mosen wants to continue.
I just want to do a little bit of rebuttal, just because I think I'm hoping to have this conversation actually with Sean, because I think with Kerry James Marshall, one of the things with painting is also the manner in which something is recognizable. And therefore, through mastery, he's also replacing blackness into paintings which have never included black people. Mm-hmm. So there is a recognizability of blackness at the same time as mastery. In architecture, that's much harder to do because how do you introduce in the same manner that in painting, the concept of recognizability is something that could be incorporated. So I think that's like one of the beauties and one of the really incredible challenges of what you're doing, even in terms of recomposition, because recomposition on one level in architecture is a kind of postmodern concept of recomposing something that through its recognizability can then talk about history. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about something different than that. And I think that's why I started my last comment by appreciating the kind of tensions or the conflicts that are there, because the question of recognition, of visual recognition, is very different in architecture than it is in painting, in the same way. So I think that the challenges of this thing that you're calling, it's a kind of exactitude, but at the same time touches on some of the things that you've inherited, is really amazingly exciting to see you kind of think about those issues and develop those. I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.